From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Look, if she shows up and makes a credible showing, that'll be very interesting, and we'll have to make a decision. But I can only say this, he is such an outstanding man. Very hard for me to imagine that anything happens.
Senator Grassley gives Dr. Christine Blasey Ford a 10 a.m. Friday deadline to decide if she will publicly or privately testify to the Senate Judiciary Committee about her allegations Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh attempted to rape her when they were both teenagers. We'll look at a Nation investigation headlined The Anti-Catholic Playbook that exposes how a secret network of right-wing activists shaped Kavanaugh's views. Then to South Carolina, where two women who were being transported by sheriff's deputies to a mental health facility drowned when the van they were riding in was overcome by floodwaters. The deputies in the vehicle survived. Family members want to know why they were transported through dangerous floodwaters and how exactly they died. Then we speak with journalist Shane Bauer, who went undercover as a prison guard at a private prison in Louisiana and found horrific conditions.
There was widespread frustration, not just with inmates, but also with staff on how the company was running the prison. And the things that I saw were long-standing.
Shane Bauer's new book, American Prison, looks at the history of making profits from prisons, starting with convict labor in colonial settlements. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Senate Judiciary Chair Chuck Grassley has set a Friday morning deadline of 10 a.m. Eastern Time for Christine Blasey Ford to respond to his invitation to speak to the committee about her allegation that Supreme Court Justice nominee Brett Kavanaugh attempted to rape her at a high school party when she was 15 years old. But Dr. Blasey Ford's lawyers have said an FBI investigation into her claim should be conducted before the committee holds a hearing. On Wednesday, President Trump openly doubted Dr. Blasey Ford's claim.
Look, if she shows up and makes a credible showing, that'll be very interesting, and we'll have to make a decision. But I can only say this, he is such an outstanding man. Very hard for me to imagine that anything happens.
This comes as Vanity Fair is reporting Trump's daughter Ivanka has told her father to, quote, cut bait and drop Kavanaugh over the attempted rape allegations. Meanwhile, one of Blasey Ford's high school classmates revealed on Facebook she remembers hearing about the alleged assault at the time. Christina Miranda King wrote, quote, this incident did happen. South Korean President Moon Jae-in says he plans to speak with President Trump soon about the desire of both South and North Korea to officially declare an end to the Korean War this year. The news comes as Moon wraps up a historic three-day summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Earlier today, Moon spoke about his vision for a nuclear-free Korean peninsula.
From Mount Paektu to Mount Halla, we promise to make our beautiful rivers and mountains a land of peace without nuclear weapons and nuclear threats, and to pass it on to the future generations.
Animal rights activists have released shocking video footage from factory farms in North Carolina that were flooded during Hurricane Florence. Activists from the group Direct Action Everywhere say they found barns with thousands of drowned chickens and dumpsters filled with dead piglets.
As you can see, there are thousands of baby piglets in these dumpsters outside of these pig facilities, dumped like garbage into giant metal dumpsters.
Communities across Puerto Rico are holding memorials across the island today to mark the first anniversary of Hurricane Maria, the devastating storm that killed thousands and caused the longest blackout in U.S. history. Puerto Rico's governor recently updated the death toll from the storm to 2,975 after multiple news outlets and universities demonstrated thousands of people died during the days and weeks after Hurricane Maria. A Harvard study estimates the death toll might be as high as 4,645. But last week, President Trump claimed the death numbers were inflated by Democrats to make him look bad. He said the government's response to the storm was an incredible, unsung success. In Puerto Rico, local residents criticized Trump's comments. Sharon Nunez-Cortez is a resident of Barceloneta.
Well, how can Trump give an opinion if he hasn't come to see the misfortune that is a reality? Because he came and was interviewed in an area where there wasn't a disaster. They should have taken him to where there was a disaster, where helicopters had to rescue people who couldn't leave their homes because there was nowhere to go. There were floods that even swept away bridges, but he is giving his opinion from the comfort of his chair without knowing what really happened.
Sin conocimiento de causa.
In news from Washington, President Trump is continuing to openly attack Attorney General Jeff Sessions. In an interview with The Hill, Trump said, quote, "I don't have an attorney general. It's very sad." During the interview, Trump criticized Sessions for his recusal from the Russian probe, his performance during his confirmation hearing, and his handling of his duties as attorney general. In news from Capitol Hill, the Senate has voted 93-7 to approve a $674 billion military budget bill. Every Democratic senator supported the bill. 6 Republicans and independent Senator Bernie Sanders opposed it. The FBI and Department of Justice are reportedly planning to defy President Trump and redact documents that Trump ordered to be fully declassified earlier this week. On Monday, Trump gave the unusual directive to release unredacted materials related to the Russia probe, including the FISA surveillance warrant application for Trump campaign advisor Carter Page and text messages of former FBI and Department of Justice officials. The proposed redactions are expected to be submitted to the Director of National Intelligence before being handed over to the White House. In news from the Middle East, the Israeli military shot and killed a 15-year-old boy in southern Gaza today during a protest near the fence with Israel. Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have been protesting since March 30th under the banner of the Great March of Return. According to health officials in Gaza, Israeli forces have killed at least 173 Palestinians and wounded over 18,000 people since the beginning of the protests. Meanwhile, in Gaza City, employees of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine, protested Wednesday against job cuts. UNRWA is reducing jobs following the Trump administration's cut to all funding of the agency. This is Amal Albash, deputy chair of the Union of Palestinian Employees at UNRWA in Gaza.
Gaza needs a lot of help because of the siege and the sanctions. They have no solutions for Gaza. They are blackmailing us politically. They want Gaza to give up politically or there will be no solutions. Because of this, UNRWA as an organization is being punished, and we, as Palestinians and refugees, are being punished in Gaza so that we will give up.
In Germany, a journalist has died while covering the eviction of protesters from the Hambach forest. For the past 6 years, activists have occupied the forest in an attempt to stop the planned expansion of a nearby open-pit coal mine. But over the past 2 weeks, German police have been clearing the protest encampment, evicting activists from their tree houses. The journalist died after falling from a bridge connecting 2 such houses. On Sunday, 9 environmental activists were injured as police tried to remove them from the tree houses. To see our full coverage of the Hambach forest occupation, you can go to democracynow.org. The editor of the New York Review of Books, Ian Buruma, is out after outrage over the publication of an essay by disgraced Canadian media personality Jian Ghomeshi, who has been accused of sexual assault and harassment by 20 women. It's unclear if Buruma was fired or resigned. The essay in question is part of an upcoming issue that features several men who were accused of sexual assault or other forms of sexual misconduct under the headline, The Fall of Men. In a recent interview defending his decision, Buruma said, quote, "I made a themed issue about Me Too perpetrators who were not convicted by the judiciary but by social media," he said, "and now I am on the pillory myself," unquote. Responding to the news, writer Roxane Gay tweeted, "What would possess an esteemed publication like the New York Review of Books to publish that Jian Ghomeshi piece? I wonder which publication will give a victim of sexual harassment or violence 7,000 words to discuss her or his experience." In other Me Too news, the Dallas Mavericks and the basketball team's billionaire owner, Mark Cuban, were sanctioned by the NBA after an independent investigation substantiated a number of allegations against the men within the organization. The findings include improper conduct in the workplace and domestic violence. Former team president and chief executive, Turdima Usuri, was determined to have sexually harassed and touched multiple female employees. Mark Cuban publicly apologized and said he will pay $10 million to women's organizations as part of an agreement with the NBA. The Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Group has announced plans to bail out more than 500 women and teenagers from Rikers Island in New York in an attempt to show how the current bail system criminalizes poverty. The group's president, Kerry Kennedy, said, quote, "There are no wealthy people on Rikers Island because if you are wealthy, you go free because you make bail." In news from Chicago, disgraced Chicago Police Commander John Burge has died at the age of 70. Between 1972 and 1991, more than 200 people, most of them African American, were tortured under his reign. Officers under his command routinely used electric shock, suffocation, and with plastic bags and typewriter covers, among other methods, to extract confessions from men who were later shown to be innocent. In 2015, the Chicago City Council approved a $5.5 million reparations fund for victims of police torture. One victim of the torture was an African-American man named Darrell Cannon, who spent more than 20 years in prison, who confessed to a murder he did not commit after being tortured by officers under Burge's command. Darrell Cannon appeared on Democracy Now! In 2015.
November the 2nd, 1983, about 15 all-white detectives invaded my apartment, terrorized me, my common-law wife, and my cat. And during that day, I was tortured in despicable ways, from them using electric caliper to shock me on my genitals and in my mouth. They tried to hang me by my handcuffs, which was cuffed behind my back, and they tried to play a game of Russian roulette on me with a shotgun, and they ended up chipping my 2 front teeth and splitting my upper lip.
And Code Pink co-founder Medea Benjamin disrupted an event at the Hudson Institute where the U.S. Special Envoy to Iran, Brian Hook, spoke on Wednesday. Benjamin took to the stage shortly after Hook ended his speech.
It is time for all nations to join us in holding Iran to a new level of accountability for its destructive behavior, especially its lawless pursuit of ballistic missiles. Thank you.
That is the most ridiculous thing I have seen. The world community wants to keep the Iran nuclear deal. Our allies are the Germans, the French, the British. They want to keep in this deal. The world community wants to keep the deal. Let's talk about normal countries. Let's talk about Saudi Arabia. Is that who our allies are? They are the biggest threat to the world community. And let's talk. You're hurting me. You're actually hurting me. I want to ask, do you think these sanctions are hurting the regime or are they hurting the Iranian people? They're hurting the Iranian people. You are making a case for war with Iran. How did the war with Iraq turn out? You're doing exactly the same thing we did in the case of Iraq. We don't want another war in the Middle East. Let's see. How does Iraq turn out? How did Libya turn out? We have the people of Syria suffering. And how dare you bring up the issue of Yemen? It's the Saudi bombing that is killing most people in Yemen. So let's get real. No more war. Peace with Iran.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Senate Judiciary Chair Chuck Grassley has set a 10 a.m. Friday morning deadline for Dr. Christine Blasey Ford to decide whether she will testify about her allegation that Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh attempted to rape her at a high school party when she was 15 years old. But Dr. Blasey Ford's lawyers have said an FBI investigation into her claims should be conducted before the committee holds a hearing. Attorney Lisa Banks issued a statement Wednesday saying, quote, "The committee's stated plan to move forward with a hearing that has only 2 witnesses is not a fair or good faith investigation. There are multiple witnesses whose names have appeared publicly and should be included in any proceeding. The rush to a hearing is unnecessary and contrary to the committee discovering the truth," end quote. In a letter to Blasey Ford's legal team, Grassley said, quote, "It is not the FBI's role to investigate a matter such as this." He spoke to reporters Wednesday.
Our focus right now is doing everything that we can to make Dr. Ford comfortable with coming before our committee, either in an open session or a closed session or a public or a private interviews. That's 4 different ways she can choose to come. And so I'm not worried about anything other than just focusing for the next few days on encouraging her to come.
Republican Senator Susan Collins of Maine, who's a key vote in Kavanaugh's Supreme Court nomination, also urged Blasey Ford to testify. She spoke to WVOM Radio Wednesday.
I don't think she can reject, having made all of these serious allegations, I don't think that she can reject all those options, because otherwise there are these very serious allegations hanging over the head of a nominee who has emphatically denied them. And that's just not a good way for us to end. So I think she needs to come forward, and I think we need to provide her with any protection that she may ask for herself and her family.
Meanwhile, Dr. Blasey Ford's former schoolmate wrote on Facebook saying she recalls hearing about the alleged assault involving Kavanaugh, though she says she had no first-hand information to corroborate the accuser's claims. Christine Miranda King wrote, quote, "Christine Blasey Ford was a year or so behind me. I did not know her personally, but I remember her. This incident did happen." King has since removed the post. This comes as President Trump has stepped up his defense of Kavanaugh, saying it was hard for him to imagine, quote, anything happened. He referred to Judge Kavanaugh as Justice Kavanaugh 3 times during a 7-minute exchange with reporters.
I would say this. I think he's an extraordinary man. I think he's a man of great intellect, as I've been telling you, and he has an unblemished record. Look, if she shows up and makes a credible showing, that'll be very interesting, and we'll have to make a decision. But I can only say this. He is such an outstanding man. Very hard for me to imagine that anything happened.
The word justice is only used for a Supreme Court judge. Well, for more, we're joined in Washington, D.C. by Sarah Posner, reporting fellow at the Investigative Fund at the Nation Institute. She has a new investigation about Kavanaugh headlined The Anti-Catholic Playbook. And her article for the Washington Post is headlined, "To Trump, Kavanaugh's testimony about religious liberty made him worth the pick." She's also author of the book God's Prophets, Faith, Fraud, and the Republican Crusade for Values Voters. Sarah, welcome back to Democracy Now! First, just respond to the latest. The deadline that Dr. Blasey Ford has been given, 10 o'clock Eastern Time, Friday morning, to testify either publicly or privately to the Senate Judiciary Committee. Your thoughts on what has taken place now, the refusal of the Senate Judiciary Chair, Grassley, to allow anyone else to speak, or what Blasey Ford is calling for, an investigation by the FBI that even Anita Hill got, an investigation so that this is not just a he said, she said affair.
Right. And let's remember that the investigation that Dr. Blasey Ford has asked the FBI to conduct is not an investigation into whether a crime was committed. You know, this would be a crime under state law, not federal law, and the statute of limitations has passed. So I think that the Republicans are trying to make it seem that she's asking the FBI to open a criminal investigation into Kavanaugh. Instead, she is asking the FBI to make this investigation part of the background check that every nominee for a federal court or for a federal political appointment has to undergo. And we know from the experience with Trump's now disgraced staff secretary, Rob Porter, that the White House doesn't take that background checking by the FBI very seriously. So they're basically saying, no, we don't want to make this part of the background check for Judge Kavanaugh. We just want to go ahead with his nomination without having the FBI fully investigate everything that might be part of his background. Now, as far as making Dr. Blasey Ford show up and testify in front of the committee, just her and Judge Kavanaugh seems preposterous under the circumstances, given that she says that there was another person in the room, this writer, Mark Judge, who has said he will not show up to testify. And given that hundreds of people who were in school with both Judge Kavanaugh and Dr. Blasey Ford in the 1980s have come forward saying they believe Dr. Blasey Ford, that this was part of the environment at Georgetown Prep and at other elite private schools around the Washington area, including other elite Catholic schools. And so, I think it's 300 people signed a letter from other surrounding schools, including Georgetown Prep, and 925 women signed a letter, fellow alumna of Holton Arms School, where Dr. Blasey Ford went to high school, saying that they believe her and that they would want to see an investigation. And I would also point your readers to a very important article in the Washington Post this morning about which is based on interviews with over 24 women who went to elite private schools in the Washington area where they intersected with people at Georgetown Prep and people at other elite boys' Catholic schools, and that the environment was one of heavy drinking, drug use, and regular sexual assault and sexual abuse of these girls.
Well, I'd like to turn to writing that's emerged by Mark Judge, the man Blasey Ford says was in the room when Kavanaugh allegedly assaulted her as a teenager. In his memoirs, Judge has depicted his high school as a place where students drank excessively, attended, quote, masturbation class, and lusted after girls from nearby Catholic schools. But Judge's 1997 memoir, Wasted, mentions a Bart O. Kavanaugh character who passes out drunk and throws up in a car. In a 2015 article headlined Hard Case Crime, The Beauty of Male Passion, Judge writes about what he calls damseling, which he describes as making a woman a passive damsel in distress who needs rescuing. He goes on to write, quote, of course a man must be able to read a woman's signals, and it's a good thing that feminism is teaching young men that no means no and yes means yes. But there's also that ambiguous middle ground where the woman seems interested and indicates, whether verbally or not, that the man needs to prove himself to her. And if that man is any kind of man, he'll allow himself to feel the awesome power, the wonderful beauty of uncontrollable male passion, Judge wrote. So Sarah, can you respond to that and what you think that says about this atmosphere that Georgetown Prep, the school that they both attended, had? And also, let me just go to comments that Kavanaugh has made about this private school, Georgetown Prep, speaking very recently at Catholic University's Columbus School of Law in 2015.
We had a good saying that we've held firm to this day, as the dean was reminding me before the talk, which is what happens at Georgetown Prep stays at Georgetown Prep. That's been a good thing for all of us, I think.
So that's Judge Kavanaugh speaking in 2015 about Georgetown Prep, the school he attended when he allegedly committed this attempted rape. So could you respond to that, Sarah?
Well, I think that this is another example of why Dr. Blasey Ford's account needs to be taken seriously, and that as part of its advise and consent, the Senate really needs to look into this and interview other witnesses, not just bring Dr. Blasey Ford and Judge Kavanaugh to testify, his word against her word. It's becoming abundantly clear, even by the account of Kavanaugh himself and Mark Judge, that there was an environment there that was out of control, quite frankly. And let's be very clear and fair here. We're not saying that every student at Georgetown Prep acted this way, but according to this article in the Washington Post this morning, which I again urge everyone to read, this was a very prevalent atmosphere there. The drinking, the drugs, the abuse of girls from neighboring high schools. So, to look past all of this, look past what Mark Judge has written, look past Kavanaugh's own remarks, would be a dereliction of the Senate's duty. And quite frankly, I can't imagine a White House that takes the background check system seriously not calling on the FBI to reopen its background check on Judge Kavanaugh. Let me also add that Judge Kavanaugh has injected his own Catholic education into the confirmation process as proof of his, values and morals bona fides. When he accepted President Trump's nomination to the Supreme Court and gave a speech in the White House, he pointed to his education at Georgetown Prep and said that the school's motto was men for others, and said that that drove his desire for public service and to serve other people. So he has portrayed the environment at Georgetown Prep in two different ways. He's portrayed it as an environment where he learned the value of service to other human beings. And he's also implied that it was like Vegas, and we're not going to talk about what happened there to other people.
Sarah, I want to move into your investigation. And if you can talk about how Kavanaugh has been portrayed by his supporters and how the revelations have compromised that image. And this takes us into this investigation you did called the Anti-Catholic Playbook.
Right. So for several cycles of Supreme Court nominations, conservatives have sought to portray Democrats' questions about Supreme Court nominees' views on issues like abortion and LGBT rights as anti-religious or anti-Catholic bigotry. Kavanaugh is well familiar with this strategy because when he served in the George W. Bush White House as associate White House counsel, he was deeply involved in shepherding Bush's federal court nominees through the nomination process. And there were a couple of them who had publicly expressed extreme hardline views on the abortion and LGBT rights issues. And under questioning by Democrats about their views, Republicans pushed back and tried to portray those questions as being anti-Catholic bigotry. They ran an ad that basically, portrayed a courtroom with a sign over it that said Catholics need not apply, trying to hearken back to a time when there was real, anti-Catholic bigotry in American society. And they even deployed this tactic against Democrats who were Catholic. So in the 2004 election, after some of these nominees had been through this process and Republicans had tried to portray Democratic questioning as anti-Catholic bigotry, this network of conservative political and PACs and political advocacy organizations attacked Catholic Democrats who were running for office, specifically Tom Daschle, who was then the Senate Minority Leader, and John Kerry, who was running for president. And they were attacked as, being anti-Catholic. They both lost. And their candidacies were to prove quite pivotal to the Republican strategy for stacking the courts, because had Daschle won, that would have increased Democrats' chance at the time of retaking the Senate, and he would have had control over the nomination process. And obviously, if Kerry had won, he would have been the president nominating judicial nominees instead of George W. Bush. Bush won, the Republicans retained control of the Senate, and then Bush successfully appointed both John Roberts and Samuel Alito to the Supreme Court during that second term. So Kavanaugh was very familiar with that strategy. That strategy is carried out by a network of advocacy groups and public relations professionals who have said that they carefully craft the image of a nominee ahead of time to create a positive image of the nominee. So Kavanaugh is very familiar familiar with how all of this works. And so it's no accident that when he was accepting Trump's nomination and when he gave his opening statement to the Senate Judiciary Committee during his confirmation hearings, that he emphasized his Catholic faith, that he emphasized that he had gone to a Catholic school. He emphasized that he coaches his daughter's basketball team at a Catholic school. And he emphasized that he helps the homeless and serves meals at Catholic charities. This is all part of creating an image of Judge Kavanaugh that he's a devout Catholic who's very dedicated to serving the community. Now that he's put that image in play, I think it's fair to investigate this accounting by numerous other people that the environment at this Catholic school, whose values he extols, was one of drunkenness, debauchery, and sexual abuse.
And Sarah Posner, the ads that have been taken out that we're seeing everywhere on the networks, talk about the committee that has put this all together.
So it's now called the Judicial Crisis Network. When it was formed in late 2004 after the elections, it was called the Judicial Confirmation Network. Its goal at the time was to help get Bush's nominees confirmed. When Obama was president, they changed the name to Judicial Crisis Network. We don't know who their donors are. They've said that they're going to spend $10 million in support of Judge Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court. But they've also been involved in this idea that Democrats' questions about nominees' views on these hot-button culture war issues are evidence of anti-Catholic bigotry. For example, just last year, when Trump nominated Amy Coney Barrett to the Seventh Circuit, when Senator Feinstein questioned her about whether she would be able to separate her devout Catholic faith from the law when making decisions on cases like Roe versus Wade, Feinstein was immediately attacked. And Judicial Crisis Network ran ads depicting this as anti-Catholic bigotry. So they've been in the mix for quite some time in helping to portray these kinds of questions as somehow being anti-Catholic. And they're also very involved in creating ads about Judge Kavanaugh that portray him as a pillar of the community.
We want to thank you very much for being with us. Of course, we're going to follow this case as this unfolds. Tomorrow morning, 10 a.m., deadline for Dr. Blasey Ford set by Chuck Grassley, the head of the Senate Judiciary Committee, that she must make a decision whether she will testify publicly, privately, or not at all. Sarah Posner, we want to thank you for being with us, reporting fellow at the Investigative Fund at the Nation Institute. We're going to link to your piece, the Anti-Catholic Playbook, as well as your piece in the Washington Post to Trump. Kavanaugh's testimony about religious liberty made him worth the pick. Your book, God's Prophets, Faith, Fraud, and the Republican Crusade for Values Voters. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute.
I'm tired of waiting. I've slowly been losing my patience. I'd like to inspire some change. We're trying to find our voice, hoping that someone will listen and hear us, so children don't have the same fate. We're fighting for something worth justice. We're fighting for a plague upon us, a plague that affects everyone I know. Me too, me too. I would like to change this too. I would like to feel as though
Me Too by Julia Freifield here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We go now to South Carolina, where two women who were being transported by sheriff's deputies to a mental health facility drowned Tuesday when the van they were riding in was overcome by floodwaters. The two sheriff's deputies in the vehicle survived. 45-year-old Wendy Newton and 43-year-old Nicolette Green are two of at least 37 people killed by Hurricane Florence since the storm made landfall. Both women had gone to hospitals Tuesday morning when they were involuntarily committed and detained. Less than 24 hours later, they were dead. News reports originally called the women detainees and said they had been shackled to the back of the van when they drowned in the rising waters in Marion County, South Carolina, near the Little PD River. Authorities are now saying they were mental health patients and the women were not handcuffed.
Family members are demanding to know why the two women were transported through dangerous floodwaters and how exactly they died. Wendy Newton's daughter Allison told the New York Times, why the hell would they leave a safe, dry area to go to God knows what? Something feels wrong about this. This is Horry County Sheriff Philip Thompson speaking Wednesday night. He was asked by a reporter if the deputies driving the transport van had driven around barriers on the flooded road, ignoring the warnings.
We had 3 different people doing investigations. Obviously, it appears that they did. My question is, I want to know why. What were the circumstances and what happened at that particular time?
Well, for more, we go to Columbia, South Carolina, where we're joined by Meg Kennard, a reporter with Associated Press who's been following this story closely. Her latest article headlined, 2 women drown as van swept into floodwaters. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, Meg. Please explain what you understand at this point took place.
Good morning. Yes, we understand that these women were being transported by Horry County Sheriff's deputies through the PD area of South Carolina, where there is a lot of flooding happening right now, and it's going to continue for several days. They were being sent to medical facilities in a different area. They went through an area of Marion County that is, as you noted, next to the Little PD River, one of the bodies of water that has been quickly rising as the water continues to flood into the state from North Carolina. Their van was swept away in rushing, rising water. The deputies were able to get out. Sheriff Thompson says they tried to get the women out, but for some reason weren't able to get into the back of the van. They called for help. And as you noted, their bodies were pulled out of the water yesterday.
And Meg, can you talk about the time that lapsed between the incident and the recovery of their bodies and why you think it took so long?
The first radio call for this came in around 6 p.m. on Tuesday night. It wasn't until yesterday afternoon, so if not 24 hours, very close to 24 hours later, that the women's bodies were finally recovered. When the rescue crews got to them in the first place on Tuesday evening, it was beginning to get dark. The conditions were very dangerous. The sheriff and the coroner and other officials on the scene have talked about how quickly, just in between the call coming in and the rescue crews getting there, how much the water had already gone up. So a determination was made not to continue those efforts and to resume them at daybreak. The sheriff noted yesterday that he's not exactly sure why the deputies couldn't get the door open. Maybe it was a water pressure issue. Maybe it was because of the positioning of the van underneath the water. But a specialized crew was flown in from Charleston to help with the recovery effort. And state police tell us that it was successful at some point very late yesterday afternoon.
So, Meg, talk about this issue of whether or not they were shackled. One of the daughters saying when the police came to take her mother that they had handcuffs. This is Tom Berry with the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division speaking about the deaths.
The 2 individuals were recovered from the van, and we have heard that there were stories going around that they may have been encased in shackles or handcuffs. That was not true. They were not shackled. They were not handcuffed. Unfortunately, they are deceased, but at least now we can tell their families that their bodies have been recovered and will be returned to their loved ones. Now we get into the difficult part, which is the investigation of the event itself. We have a lot of evidence to go through. We have a lot of information to look at. We have a lot of people to talk to, and that's going to take time.
So that's Tom Berry with the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. A local TV station did report that they were shackled. So, Meg, can you talk about what you understand at this point and if you believe what the authorities are saying?
We did see those very early reports about this incident that started circulating right after it happened, that first off, these women were referred to initially in reports as inmates, and secondly, that they were shackled or somehow else restrained in the back of that van. Obviously, we have learned now that they were patients, not inmates. And the sheriff told us yesterday that it's his understanding that when patients are transported by deputies around the state, they will sometimes be restrained, but in situations where the patient is becoming manic or is believed to be a harm to himself or to others. Sheriff Thompson said yesterday he did not believe that that was the case with these individuals, but remember, he was speaking to us about this before their bodies were recovered. Tom Berry made those statements after the recovery occurred and noted that there were no handcuffs or shackles.
And Meg, what do we know about what has happened to the two sheriff's deputies who were responsible?
The deputies have been placed on administrative leave. That is typical in South Carolina when the State Law Enforcement Division is conducting an investigation into something involving a law enforcement agency here in the state. So they are still considered employed. They are still deputies with the Horry County Sheriff's Office. There is also an internal investigation occurring in their own department, as well as the State Law Enforcement Division, and the Highway Patrol is also looking into the incident. So until that internal investigation is completed, they will remain on administrative leave, and then the outcomes of the other investigations will perhaps determine their ultimate fate.
I mean, obviously, the horror of all this, these women being taken through, it was clear that this area was in danger of being flooded. And the fact that they were really being held in the back of the van, it was a very dangerous situation, which is why their family members are so deeply upset right now, aside from losing their loved ones. But if you could say, what is the policy of the department when it comes to, even if it is a prisoner, transporting a prisoner in these dangerous times, not to mention whether prisons are evacuated during, the situation like Hurricane Florence?
Sheriff Thompson noted yesterday that he was complying with a court order to transport these women. He said that when those orders are issued, it is his job to ensure that the patient gets from point A to point B. There are a lot of questions remaining about why this had to occur then, why there couldn't have been some sort of an emergency delay, and also why the deputies took the route that they took. The highway where this occurred, Highway 76, is very near the Little Petey River, as we've discussed, which is quickly rising and is an area of major flooding concern as these waters continue to go up around South Carolina. So that will be part of the State Law Enforcement Division's investigation, as well as the Highway Patrol probe into why they were on that road at that time. Sheriff Thompson also noted yesterday that he did believe that the deputies had driven around a barricade, which would have been blocking off this road, noting that it wasn't safe to travel on. So again, as these investigations go on, we will learn more about why those decisions were made the way that they were on Tuesday night.
Meg Kennard, I want to thank you for being with us, South Carolina correspondent for the Associated Press. We'll link to your piece. 2 women drown as van swept into flood waters. This is Democracy Now! As we continue to look at, South Carolina officials also coming under fire for refusing to evacuate thousands of prisoners in mandatory evacuation zones as Hurricane Florence barreled down on the state. This is South Carolina Governor McMaster announcing a mandatory evacuation of the state's coast.
This is a real hurricane that we have coming, and our goal is to protect lives and property. Now, we know that this evacuation order that I'm issuing is going to be inconvenient for some people. It's going to be inconvenient, but we do not want to risk one South Carolina life in this hurricane.
Prisoners at McDougall Correction Institution in Berkeley County and Ridgeland Correctional Institution in Jasper County were forced to remain in the prisons when Hurricane Florence hit, despite evacuation orders. Well, for more, we're joined by another guest in Columbia, South Carolina, Kimberly Smith, community organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. She's been protesting South Carolina's choice not to evacuate prisoners during the hurricane. Kimberly, welcome to Democracy Now! Explain what happened.
What's happening? Well, what happened to begin with after the Lee Correctional incident in April 15? We've been having ongoing demonstrations to bring light of what's going on and how those incarcerated are treated in Columbia and South Carolina in general. One of the major points I was raising during Hurricane Florence is why wasn't Governor Henry McMaster or Brian Sterling, our director of South Carolina Department of Corrections, why were they ignoring direct orders to evacuate those incarcerated?
Well, prisoners in South Carolina were, as you say, not evacuated when Hurricane Florence hit, but they were put to work making sandbags to prepare for the storm's arrival. The South Carolina Department of Corrections tweeted a photo of the sandbags, writing, quote, "Inmates assigned to McDougal and Wateree have prepared over 35,000 sandbags." The department also tweeted, quote, "Agency staff and inmates have prepared 1,000-pound sandbags to help protect the roads and citizens along the coast." Kimberly, could you talk about that, the kind of work that prisoners were asked to do?
They were asked to fill sandbags not for their own safety, but to protect the safety of the citizens that are incarcerated. They were using the labor of these individuals to protect the citizens of South Carolina and on those coastal areas. They were doing the work that other people in our, legislature, other people could do. They weren't trying to protect themselves. They don't care about how the prisoners were going to fare during the storm, but they wanted to use their labor to have them make sandbags so that no one else would have to do it.
And their concerns, you've been speaking with people in the prisons about what would happen with the storm. What were the prisoners saying?
A lot of times when there's like a natural disaster of this magnitude and flooding in South Carolina, a lot of times power goes out. So those incarcerated, they're locked in their cells because this, in this day and age, everything is like, a lot of these places run on electronics. So when the power goes out, they're trapped in their cells for hours, not knowing when they're going to get let out. If water goes out, which it normally does during flooding because people go in by water goes out, they'll be forced to drink out of toilets because they're not supplied with fresh water.
Well, Kimberly, in North Carolina, prisoners were evacuated. Of course, in South Carolina, they were not. What did the state in South Carolina say? What did they give as justification for not evacuating prisoners?
I think there was no justification. When we tried to speak with Governor McMaster at a press conference that he was having press conferences all week. We were not allowed inside the press conferences. We were not allowed to speak with him, interact with him at all. They had security there making sure we got nowhere near him. There was no comment. There was no acknowledgement of anything going on with those incarcerated.
Well, Kimberly Smith, we want to thank you for being with us, community organizer with the Party for Socialism Liberation, protesting South Carolina's choice not to evacuate prisoners during Hurricane Florence. And let me ask you quickly, in the last 10 seconds we have, is the danger over? I mean, while the storm leaves, you've got this tremendous threat of flooding.
No, we're still getting Little PD and all those coastal areas are still getting water from getting the flooding from North Carolina, so that we're not out of the woods yet. These people are still trapped in cells with power outages. They don't have access to fresh water. We're not out of the woods yet. We won't know until we can actually get down there and see what's going on and when I have more contact with those incarcerated.
Kimberly Smith, thanks so much for being with us. Again, community organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we're going to talk about American prisons with Shane Bauer, a man who knows. Stay with us. Justice by Toshi Regan here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
A 3-week nationwide prison strike from coast to coast just ended this month after prisoners participated in hunger strikes and called for the abolition of what they call modern-day slavery. For more, we're joined by a journalist who went undercover as a prison guard to document conditions at the Wynn Correctional Facility in Louisiana, run by the Corrections Corporations of America, now called CoreCivic.
Shane Bowers, an award-winning senior reporter at Mother Jones. He first described what he saw in a National Magazine award-winning article from Mother Jones. This week, he published his new book that draws upon that experience and dives much deeper into the history of making profit from prisons in the United States, starting with convict labor in colonial-era settlements. The book is titled American Prison, and Shane knows well about prison, both working as a prison guard in one and also being imprisoned himself in Iran for over 2 years. Shane, welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us.
Thanks.
Talk about why you wrote American Prison.
Well, I had gone undercover in a private prison. I wanted to get a really close look at what life is like inside of these corporate-run prisons. And after that, I realized that to really understand the role of profit in the American prison system, we had to go really back. And I learned that throughout American history, prisons have been run at a profit. Our earliest prisons in the 19th century were for-profit prisons where labor was being contracted out to private companies. After slavery, the entire southern system was privatized. Prisoners were essentially fulfilling the role of that slaves had filled, working in cotton fields, in coal mines for companies like the U.S. Steel Company, the world's first billion-dollar company. And
explain these. People may not be familiar with this, not to mention plantation prisons.
Yeah, there were prisoners were essentially contracted to planters and forced to pick cotton. They were whipped, tortured, had to meet labor quotas, and the system was called convict leasing. This system was actually more deadly than slavery. Every year, between 16 and 25% of prisoners would die. It was on par with the death rate of the Soviet gulags. And eventually, the states actually bought plantations themselves. So instead of sending the prisoners to private businessmen to put them to work on their fields, they would put them to work on in their own plantations. And in doing the research for this book, I discovered that the co-founder of CoreCivic, Terrell Don Hutto, started his career actually running a cotton plantation prison in Texas. It was the size of Manhattan, where inmates were forced to pick cotton, meet cotton quotas. He lived on the plantation with his family. He had what was called a houseboy, an African-American prisoner who had to serve his family. He ran the Arkansas prison system, which was entirely made of plantations. A federal judge had condemned what he called torture under Hutto. Inmates who refused to labor in the fields were put naked in solitary confinement. And he would run these plantations at a profit to the state. And it was his work and his ability to run prisons at a profit that attracted a couple of businessmen who proposed to him that they start a new company that became the Corrections Corporation of America.
Well, can you say, Shane, what substantively were the differences between public state prisons and these private prisons?
In current times or in the past?
Sorry, historically, what you're talking about.
Well, it basically the kind of privatized system of convict leasing, the states kind of became jealous of the profits that the private businessmen were making and then bought their own plantations. But substantively, there was very little difference. In fact, a lot of them were the same plantations. Angola prison in Louisiana started as after the Civil War, a man who leased all of the convicts in Louisiana named Samuel Lawrence James bought that plantation, and he used convicts and put them on the plantation and was essentially able to live a life that was identical to the life before the Civil War, where he had prisoners laboring there. Then the state later bought that plantation from him and ran it as a state prison, and it is still a state prison today, and inmates still are working in the fields there.
How did the profit motive shape what you saw when you went undercover as a prison guard in Louisiana? And, I mean, you begin with this just amazing story. You actually did not lie about who you were in your application to become a prison guard.
Right.
They just never asked you.
Right. Yeah. They when I did a job interview, they were almost trying to convince me to take the job. It was a $9 an hour job. The main way that the company makes money is by offering lower wages than public prisons, and also having low levels of staff in their prison. The company cuts corners in many ways through staffing, medical care. I met a man in the prison who had lost his legs to gangrene after spending months asking to be taken to a hospital. The company was resistant to take inmates to the hospital because if they would have to pay for it. All of these things kind of affect the bottom line ultimately. The prison was more violent than the state-run prisons, which were also very violent in Louisiana. There was, in a 4-month period, 200 weapons found in the prison.
And you talked about your own experience and how being in this place made you feel more violent.
Yeah, I mean, there is enormous pressure on the people who work in these prisons. Most of the people that work there are just kind of poor people from the town making $9 an hour. It's a very dangerous job, and the staffing is so low that it is literally impossible to do the duties that people are meant to do, and it has a very powerful psychological effect.
Attorney General Jeff Sessions rescinded President Obama's memo for the Bureau of Prisons not to enter into new private prison contracts. How have these for-profit prisons thrived under President Trump?
Well, when Obama announced that the federal government was going to stop using private prisons, the stock price of CoreCivic dropped by half overnight. The day that Donald Trump won the election, the stock price rose more than any company in the stock market, probably because people assumed that Trump's immigration policies would lead to greater immigrant detention, and private prison companies control about 2/3 of immigrant detention centers. After Trump was inaugurated, he rescinded the Obama-era decision, and the company is now doing better than it was a couple of years ago.
You mentioned the Don Hutto himself. Mm-hmm. I remember when we went down to Texas and went to the Don Hutto Immigration Detention Center, which is now a women's immigrant detention center in Texas. I mean, the story of the separation of families, how this has led to the thriving of these private prisons. Yeah,
actually, in the middle of that crisis, the stock price of CoreCivic rose by 14%. I mean, immigrant detention is kind of the frontier of the private prison companies. It's really their area of growth.
Well, we're going to leave it there, but we're going to do part 2, and we're going to post it online at democracynow.org under web exclusives. Shane Bauer, the award-winning senior reporter at Mother Jones, his new book is just out. It's called American Prison, a reporter's undercover journey into the business of punishment. And that does it for our show. Democracy Now! Has a job opening for a full-time broadcast engineer here in New York. Find out more at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Renee Phelps, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Tammy Warnoff, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Ravi Karan, Hani Massoud, Trina Nadura, Tamari Astudillo, and Libby Rainey. Mike DeFilippo and Miguel Noguera, our engineer. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Hugh Grant, David Prude, Ariel Boone, Vesta Godars. Tomorrow, Michael Moore on Democracy Now!, his new film Fahrenheit 11/9. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.